The rebellious girl Yunmu goes to the temple to stay for a few days every month. Unexpectedly, her childlike heart moved the gods and Buddhas in the temple. At the age of 24, she was given a man, which made her want to sleep at first sight, fall in love at second sight, and unable to extricate herself at third sight. During the arduous journey of pursuing love, Yunmu couldn't help but sigh that the divine Buddha was not benefiting her. This was simply paying the bill for her rebellious behavior of over 20 years. She was just a man, and she was not uncommon anymore. A few years later, Yunmu secretly returned to China and was caught by a dog man. While pushing the man's head away from her chest, she coldly said, "Mr. Sui, we're not suitable. It's better to keep a distance." Suiyu, who finally regained his lost heart, now wants to slap himself a few years ago. Damn the distance, AMU, from inside out, there's nothing more suitable than us. People often say that Suiyu is indifferent, with a cold face and a cold heart. He is a living cold-faced Yenluo, but no one knows that in his dark and lonely world, Yunmu is the only light, the only person who can pull him out of hell. Later, Y Group CEO, Suiyu, who never gave interviews, talked about his private life in public for the first time. "I heard that Mr. Sui is overjoyed by a daughter, I don't know if it's true." Suiyu, who has always shown a cold face, showed a gentle gaze on his face. "Well, thank you, my wife, for giving me a complete home. At the end of the year, a new beginning begins. AMU will always be by my side." Keywords of the novel. Xiaozhua Jinghao can flirt, sick Jiaoba can't handle no pop-ups, Xiaozhua Jinghao can flirt, sick Jiaoba can't handle. Download the full text, Xiaozhua Jinghao can flirt, sick Jiaoba can't handle the latest chapters. Chapter 1. I want to sleep with you. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. I want to sleep with you. A girl dressed in a dark green suspender dress stood in front of the Buddha, holding 3 incense sticks in her hand, and devoutly bowed 3 times. Everyone's gaze briefly lingered on the girl, some accusing her of being a Buddhist, yet dressed in such disrespectful attire. Some couldn't help but sigh, there are still such agile girls in the world. Yunmu never paid attention to these strange looks. According to her words, sincerity is spiritual, and Buddha doesn't have so much time to appreciate what clothes you are wearing. After inserting 3 incense sticks into the incense burner, Yunmu bowed slightly to the slightly stunned little monk with his hands clasped together. Before the monk could respond, Yunmu lifted his foot and left on his own. Although she didn't know what wish she had made, in short, bowing down didn't harm her. She only hoped that the gods and Buddhas could help her at a critical moment. She walked aimlessly on the path, feeling refreshed by the scent of incense around her. Before she could walk far, footsteps could be heard from behind. Yunmu turned around and saw the little monk in the hall rushing towards her, holding a black object in her hand. She squinted and said, "Oh, it's her own lighter." The little monk stopped a few steps away from Yunmu, his face flushed whether it was running or just seeing her. Even though he was panting, he didn't forget to fold his hands and arch slightly towards her. "Cloud Donor, your lighter." Yunmu remained silent and reached out to take the black lighter. He rubbed his thumb back and forth on the character Yun engraved in the bottom left corner. Then, he took out a box of gold cigarettes from his pocket, took one out of his mouth, and skillfully lit it with the lighter in his hand. The little monk looked at her through the misty clouds. "Worry-free." Yunmu called out to the little monk softly, "Why do you always blush when you see me?" The little monk named Wuyo was a bit confused when asked. Before she could say anything more, the sound of guzheng came from a distance, and the two of them looked together. "I saw a girl playing the guzheng vaguely in the crowd." Yunmu turned around and bowed to Wuyo, then walked towards the direction of the crowd. Worry-free watched as Yunmu left. Just as he was about to leave, his gaze touched the man standing under the tree not far away. The man seemed to have noticed someone staring at him and turned his head slightly to meet the worry-free gaze. Seeing the man looking over, even at such a distance, he felt a chill and hurriedly bowed slightly towards the man. The man nodded and then shifted his gaze away. Wuyo looked at the tall figure of the man and then at Yunmu, who was squeezing into the crowd, feeling indescribable disappointment for a moment. This is fate. Yunmu, relying on her outstanding appearance and a pair of forceful pulling hands, successfully squeezed to the front of the crowd. While everyone was criticizing her behavior, they couldn't help but stare at that face. After finishing a song, applause rang out from around, and the girls smiled slightly. The crowd gradually dispersed, leaving only Yunmu. The girl was about to pack her musical instrument when she saw Yunmu staring at her guzheng and walked towards her. "Do you want to play?" She looked at the gentle smile of the girl and couldn't help but feel good about it. She nodded and said, "Is that okay?" Of course, the girl said as she wanted to remove the armor wrapped around her finger, but Yunmu stopped her movement. She walked up to the guzheng, half of the smoke in her hand already burning. She sat on a chair, took a strong puff of smoke, and then threw it to the ground, crushing it with her shoes. Under the surprised gaze of the crowd, she gently plucked the strings and the sound of the piano came out in waves. She thought of becoming addicted and played a short section of Jay Chou's Preface to the Orchid Pavilion. After the sound was finished, she lifted the corners of her lips with satisfaction, ignoring the numbness on her fingertips. She bent down and picked up the cigarette butt, then smiled slightly at the girl beside her. "Thank you." The girl was a bit excited. She had noticed Yunmu for a long time. She looked too flamboyant and outstanding, but everyone seemed to hold hostility towards girls who smoke. When she stared at her piano, she even had a desire to see her make a fool of herself. However, when the piano sounded, she realized that this person's level was higher than hers. Yunmu didn't stop much and skillfully walked through small paths to a remote room. As soon as she stepped into the threshold, she looked up and saw a tall figure in a black suit. The man's eyes were splattered with ink, with scattered hair lazily draped over his forehead. His sharp and angular face was adorned with a pair of gold-framed glasses on his high nose bridge, which softened the cold air between his eyebrows and eyes. His thin lips lacked any curvature, and his calm and confident aura made him shy away. Yunmu felt that at this moment, his heart, which had never been beating for 20 years, suddenly jumped. The man also noticed her and looked at her with a cold gaze, which left Yunmu frozen in place for a moment. The man casually glanced away and then whispered a few words to the man in black next to him. The man received the order not to stay much and left, leaving only two people for a moment. Yunmu regained his composure, pressed down on his somewhat chaotic heart, and walked into the yard. Just a few steps away, Wuyu hurriedly rushed over from behind. When he saw the two people standing in the yard, his rapid breathing stopped for a moment. She raised an eyebrow at Wuyo and said, "Little monk, why are you blushing again?" This teasing remark brought Wuyo back to her senses, and her face turned even redder than before. "Yunmu thinks it's a bit fun." Wuyo walked in and stood not far from the two of them. Mr. Sui," he said. Yunmu turned his head to look at the man known as Mr. Sui, and Wuyo seemed to know her curiosity. He said, "This is Mr. Sui from Y Group, who comes to stay for a few days every month. You happen to be here this time, benefactor Yun." She nodded. She had heard of Y Group before, and naturally knew that the young master in front of her was what her father often referred to as a suit thug and a cold-faced Yanluo. Ignoring the obstruction in the young monk's gaze, Yunmu walked forward, his interest in him not concealed in his eyes. "Hello, my name is Yunmu." The man looked down at the woman who was one head shorter than him, with a beautiful face and a proud expression between his eyebrows and eyes. Half of his seaweed-like wavy long hair swayed behind his back and half draped over his chest. The skin under the dark green suspender was glowing white. "Sueyu." As soon as he finished speaking, Wuyo lowered his head as if accepting his fate. Master often said that gambling on this thing would only leave him with nothing. Just now, he was gambling that Sueyu wouldn't pay attention to Yunmu. But he lost the bet. The simple conversation made Yunmu couldn't help but feel a little excited. He looked at what had just happened on the other side with mixed emotions and summarized it in one sentence. I really want to sleep with him. Shen Luoshu didn't have the bold personality of Yunmu. Upon hearing these words, one couldn't help but curse, you haven't woken up yet. Who is that? Sueyu. No one can figure him out, he's unpredictable. Shen Luoshu also learned from his elder brother Shen Luochu that there were many people on the road who wanted Sueyu's life. Unfortunately, this person was really bad to the extreme, and even Yen Luo dared not accept him. Did you hear that? Yunmu, please don't provoke that Yen Luo. Shen Luochu's words flew in and out of her ears. With a random response, Yunmu found an excuse to hang up the phone, so that she wouldn't let the delicious meat run away from her mouth. Yunmu has one advantage. The things he identifies must be immediately taken into action, but there is also a disadvantage. The things he identifies do not hit the south wall and do not turn back. After tidying up the bathroom supplies he brought, he walked to the neighboring bathroom wearing a black camisole pajama. As he passed by Sueyu's room, he saw that the lights were still on. Yunmu quickened his pace and glanced at the illuminated bathroom without paying attention. The door was pushed open and she looked at the scene before her, standing in place in a daze. The man had obvious gunshot and knife wounds on his back. Sueyu turned around and saw a tattoo on his right arm. As for the pattern, to be honest, Yunmu didn't pay attention. Water poured down from his head, and her focus was fixed between the man's legs along the water flow. Sueyu saw her unblinking gaze and said coldly, have you seen enough? Upon hearing these words, she immediately regained her senses and looked up at the man with a blushing face. I don't know, you're. Yunmu's voice became quieter as she explained. Sueyu ignored it and turned around in a tone-free voice, get out. As usual, the little girl would naturally be scared away when she saw such a scene, but Yunmu was naturally rebellious. The more proper things were, the more she would go against them. Sueyu heard the sound of the door closing as expected, but when he turned around, he unexpectedly saw the woman still standing in place. He frowned impatiently. Yunmu placed the bathtub he was holding on the table beside him, and in Sueyu's impatient gaze, he slowly spoke up, I have always had a sense of responsibility. Since I have looked at you thoroughly, I will be responsible to you. How about making a promise with my own life? The man's eyebrows were furrowed as expected, but Yunmu continued, if you feel it's too fast, or maybe you'll come back. Sueyu found this statement extremely interesting. He released his furrowed brow and looked at her with a playful expression on his face, why do you still pay? The woman's eyes sparkled, of course it's a tooth for tooth, a naked body for a naked body. As soon as Yunmu spoke, the temperature of the surrounding hot air suddenly rose, and an ambiguous aura instantly surrounded the two of them. Sueyu looked at the woman with a face full of newborn calves and fearless tigers, and walked over. The woman exuded a faint fragrance, and he lifted his hand to pinch her face. Yunmu, you're really not afraid of death. Listening to the man's gritting voice, Yunmu smiled even more recklessly, what? Threatening me? Sueyu sneered, of course it's not a threat, but suddenly remembered that it's been a long time since I last visited Mr. Yun. How about we go together? A few seconds later, he was very satisfied to hear the sound of the bathroom door being closed, even though the door was almost about to be sacrificed in glory. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Farewell without farewell. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Farewell without farewell. Yunmu was awakened from thirst. When he woke up, it was already dawn, but it was still early. As soon as he opened his mouth and yawned, he heard the sound of worry-free in the yard. Mr. Sui, breakfast is ready. Sueyu. With a movement in her heart, Yunmu walked to the window and quietly pulled the curtains. She looked out through the gap and saw the person dressed in black sleeveless sportswear. Due to just finished exercising, beads of sweat were hanging on her arms. This time, she could see the patterns on her arms clearly. In addition to the Buddha statue, there were also letters, numbers, and Chinese characters. Seeing Sueyu lifting her foot and planning to walk outside, Yunmu ignored her appearance as she had just woken up and immediately opened the wooden door. The sunlight shone on her fair face, and Yunmu narrowed his eyes slightly and raised his hand to wave. "Good morning." The two people in the yard looked at her at the same time, and saw the woman in a black silk suspender skirt, with the tail reaching up to her thighs. Her long and thin legs were exposed in this way, and her chest was propped up with a proud curve. The two protrusions were also clearly visible. Her skin was as white as sheep fat, with pink and tender white, and her long hair was just curled up like ink. Her red lips and white teeth, and her eyes were sharp and thin. Looking up, she was enchanting, not like a fairy, but a touch of red in pure color, a hint of desire in simplicity, and she immediately fell into those passionate eyes. Weo glanced at it and immediately lowered her head, blushing from her face to her neck. Yunmu only realized a bit of recklessness when she saw the little monk's reaction. However, she had always been like this, looking at Sueyu with disappointed eyes. She did not see the change in the man's face. Before Yunmu could speak more, the man had already stepped out of the door. The little monk bowed and said, "Master Yun, breakfast is ready." Yunmu nodded and said, "All right, you've worked hard without any worries." Worry-free responded politely with a hint of panic, then turned around and walked away. Yunmu looked at the somewhat deserted figure and couldn't help but laugh out loud. "It's really cute, little monk." Yunmu changed into a dark red qipao embroidered with silver threads today, revealing her protruding and upturned figure. Perhaps it was still early in the morning, with a hint of coolness, so she casually put on a white shawl with tassels. Sueyu had already sat at the table, and the food in the temple was always light. What's more, in the morning, clear congee and a few dishes, Yunmu walked to his opposite side. For a moment, neither of them spoke. On the one hand, Sueyu was not a talkative person, and on the other hand, Yunmu had a habit of eating without speaking or sleeping since childhood. Yunmu is in a hurry to eat. While looking at Sueyu in the opposite side, she is picking up the congee in the bowl. The man stands up, and her congee is finished. With Sueyu's footsteps, she also stands up and walks out. There was already a group of people practicing martial arts in front of the temple gate, and the sun was also rising. Somewhere, the sound of ringing the bell came from, causing ripples to ripple in Yunmu's heart. She loved this kind of life, doing it at sunrise and resting at sunset. This is also why she comes here to stay for a few days every month, which can be considered as seeking a clean space in her heart. But this time it was a bit different. She looked at the figure of the man in front of her, changed into sportswear, and put on a suit that seemed rigid and lifeless to her. She quickly walked forward and walked side by side with Sueyu. Before she could speak, she heard the man next to her speak first. "Stop being a follower." Yunmu gave him a glare, and the silver-free 300-faced replied, "You speak as if I'm some pervert." The man chuckled lightly, as if responding, "Aren't you?" "Sueyu, I'm serious. I don't just want to sleep with you now. Little girl, you don't have a good eye. It's not very good, but your vision is even worse. You're not attracted to such a dazzling beauty by your side." Sueyu couldn't help but glance at her and said, "She is truly the granddaughter of Mr. Yun." "What does it mean?" "Same thick-skinned." This made Yunmu suddenly remember the little old man at home who always played tricks with people when playing chess, and couldn't help but laugh out loud. She didn't dwell on the topic and instead said, "Aren't you tired?" "What?" Yunmu looked at the person who had climbed up the mountain early in the distance and said, "The reason why everyone came here is because they have what they are looking for in their hearts. But I am different. I have everything. I came here just to enjoy a moment of tranquility, but there are also too many selfish desires hidden here. But I like to listen to others' secrets. What about you? Although you seem to have everything, you shouldn't have come here to redeem yourself, the living king of hell. Just like me. Sueyu didn't speak, just glanced at the woman next to him who only reached his shoulder. Even though you're here to relax, you're still wearing a suit and leather shoes. I don't know, you thought you were here to negotiate. She hugged her chest with both hands and said with a pretentious tone, young people, you should live a more relaxed life. Forget it, talking too much to someone like you who can't hold back a fart for a long time is a waste of words. Let's go there and taste my skills. After saying that, regardless of whether the man agreed or not, Yunmu walked to the tea room ahead on his own. Sueyu thinks Yunmu is extremely interesting. Yunmu's craftsmanship was taught by Master Yun himself. Even people like Sueyu who don't like to meddle know that Master Yun loves his legitimate granddaughter the most. However, it is said that this legitimate granddaughter left without saying goodbye after reaching adulthood at the age of 18. Yun urgently sent people to search everywhere, but he didn't expect this person to live very comfortably under his nose. I only brought Longjing this time. Yunmu washed the cup with hot water and looked up at Sueyu. Sueyu also looked at her without speaking. I personally picked it and cooked it with firewood, it's cheaper for you. Yunmu smiled. Pour the tea into the purple clay pot, cover it with the lid, and Yunmu picked up the pot and shook it back and forth a few times. Opening the lid, a fragrant aroma wafted through her nose. She nodded in satisfaction, unconsciously relaxing and immersed herself in the process of brewing tea. Sueyu watched as she couldn't conceal her happiness, seeing for the first time the quiet scene of this biting little fox. Yunmu poured the tea into a fair cup and handed it to the man, making a gesture of invitation. The soup has a bright and clear color, with a refreshing and mellow taste, and a tender and fragrant aroma. Sueyu is not a tea connoisseur and can't come up with any compliments. He can only say dryly, not bad. It's already great that he can say something good in his mouth. Yunmu almost spurted out a sip of tea. To be honest, Sueyu, I'm serious, only I don't mind you. Sueyu raised his eyebrows and looked at her, his eyes seeming to say, what are you joking about? After a long time, he spoke up and said, Yunmu, don't waste your time on me. Speaking out, the person across from him didn't react much, as if guessing that he would say so. I have an advantage, which is that I will stick to what I have set my sights on. I also have a disadvantage, being too persistent. The woman's bright smile, which was already confusing, was now full of cunning. A little fox that can charm people's hearts. Yunmu has time to play with him, but he doesn't have time to play with her. In Sueyu's view, he is just an exciting game in the boring world of women. After finishing her tea, Sueyu left, still sitting in the same spot, looking at the message sent by Shenluo on her phone. At dusk, my brother said that Sueyu does visit temples every month. I heard that his mother was a Buddhist believer before her death, maybe it's a habit he developed in the past. Yunmu didn't hesitate and made a phone call. It seemed like she was waiting for her over there, and she answered as soon as it rang. Twilight. Without hesitation, she opened the door to the mountain and said, "What did your brother say to you?" Shenluo got up from bed and said, "I didn't say anything. Anyway, let me remind you that it's not easy to take Sueyu. Unlike the one from Sister Hua's family, that big shot looks vicious and terrifying, but always pretends to be Sister Hua in his heart. But Sueyu, looking at the light breeze, doesn't actually make any progress. If you want to take him, you might have to hit your head and bleed blood. He may not even be able to feel sorry for you." Yunmu didn't speak. Shenluo knew what the little sisters was thinking, but at dusk, "I will support you in whatever you do." After hanging up the phone, Yunmu's thoughts wandered far away until someone entered the tea room. She finally regained her senses and reached out to pick up the cup, taking a sip before realizing that the water had already cooled. "Please, she's Yunmu, the one who doesn't hit the south wall and doesn't return." Yunmu had just returned to the yard when she saw the little monk coming out of Sueyu's room with a blanket, and she walked over. Worry-free. The little monk heard a voice and said, "Cloud donor." Yunmu looked into the room and found that the beds were all empty. She pointed to the room and said, "Where is Sueyu?" "Mr. Sui has already left." "Leaving?" Yunmu widened his eyes. The little monk nodded and said, "There must be something urgent." Yunmu nodded and didn't say anything more, then returned to the room on his own. The little monk looked at Yunmu's back and wanted to say something more, hesitating to say anything before finally leaving. But when he came to call Yunmu for lunch, he found the door open and there was no one inside. Even her fiery red suitcase was missing, leaving only a note on the table. "Goodbye by chance, little monk. Wuyo understands now. She won't be coming again, at least for the next few months. Not only her, but also Sueyu shouldn't be coming again." End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Kidnapping. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The source has no content or has errors. Chapter 4. Knowing difficulties and retreating. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Knowing difficulties and retreating. Yunmu looked at the red light ahead and the car slowly came to a stop. She looked inside the car and remembered that during her coming-of-age ceremony at the age of 18, the Hua family sister gave her a purple Lamborghini. However, she had only driven it once, and that one time almost caused the car to crash. Since then, the small purple car has been locked in the garage. Sueyu's car is not as flashy as they are, with a black Bentley that perfectly matches his temperament. "Sueyu, have you seen me before?" Yunmu looked at the green countdown light. The man who was asked turned on the turn signal, skillfully controlled the steering wheel, and calmly said, "No, but I've seen you before. I can't remember when, I've only seen it once." She had seen him when he was still a teenager, a bit lonely and difficult to approach. "My mother often says, I'm easy to feed, like a little grass in a crevice. You just need to water it, and I can grow as hard as I can." Yunmu turned to look at him, his eyes shining brightly. "So, don't you want such a tenacious little grass? I can still bloom, it's beautiful." Sueyu hooked her lips. "Yunmu, you should know who I am." She always thinks that when Sueyu calls her name, it's really charming. "I know." Sueyu frowned with a hint of helplessness in her tone. "You don't know." The affirmative tone stunned Yunmu. She followed the man's gaze into the rearview mirror and immediately turned around to look back. Several black cars followed behind them. Before she could react, she heard Sueyu say, "Sit down." She immediately turned around and just sat down, clutching her seatbelt. The car quickly sped out, deviating from the way home. She turned her head to look at the person next to her, and the man's expression remained unchanged, not even frowning. However, she still felt the change in Sueyu's aura, no longer the appearance of a distant gentleman at first. The malice in her eyes gradually revealed, and a mocking smile appeared at the corner of her mouth, as if she had treated this chase as an insignificant game. This was something she had never seen before, and it was the true living king of hell that Shen Luoshu spoke of. She looked back, only a black car had not been thrown away, and the man calmly spoke, "Grab the door handle." Yunmu immediately followed suit, and the man turned the steering wheel back with one hand. The high-speed impact immediately shook the rear of the car, and she leaned tightly against the car door. As soon as she looked up, she saw the man's empty hand pulling out a black metal object from the car drawer. Yunmu widened her eyes. "Sueyu." The man lowered the car window, his eyes getting more and more excited. The car drove towards the following black car, and he reached out to the outside. After 2 gunshots, there was a piercing sound of the wheels rubbing against the ground, making it particularly eerie on this open road. The car slowly stopped, and Sueyu called for someone to handle it. Then, he took out a lighter and lit a cigarette. Through the clouds and smoke, Sueyu turned his head to look at the quiet woman. He thought he would see the woman retreat despite the difficulty, but he didn't expect to face her direct gaze. This is me, and my life. This was the first time that Sueyu spoke between the two of them. The day when someone would kill you anytime and anywhere, he treated it as his life. Yunmu snorted coldly, "Do you want me to give up?" Sueyu looked at her indifferently, with no emotion in her eyes. "I'm just telling you that you think everything is too simple," he said. "Emotion is a burden to me, I don't need it." Sueyu took the last puff of his cigarette and said, "We're not the same person. Yunmu, you should find a good family to live with, not someone like me. How do you know if you don't try?" "What?" Yunmu looked up at her, and the firmness in his eyes stunned Sueyu. "How do you know you're not that kind of person without trying?" Sueyu sent her back to Yunshi and left directly. Yunmu sat by the window, looking at the dark sky, and could vaguely see a few stars. Cough. Yunmu turned his head and, as expected, saw the little old man standing at the door. "What's going on? After flying out for so long, now I finally know I'm back." Mr. Yun sat in his chair. "Tell me about you, a lady from a wealthy family. Why did you leave alone without saying a word? What other note are you leaving? You really want to anger me." Mr. Yun looked so angry that he couldn't help but sneak a glance at Yunmu. "Stop acting, I'm not coming back now. If you keep nagging, I'll really go out and not come back," Yunmu muttered to himself. You stinky girl." Grandpa Yun couldn't help but take it easy and then continued, "I heard that Sueyu brought you back." Yunmu nodded. "Does he have any other thoughts, this stinky kid? If he doesn't pay attention to anything, it's either cheating or stealing." Mr. Yun frowned tightly. Yunmu pursed his lips and said weakly, "It's your granddaughter and I who have been rejected many times, both openly and secretly." I still lick my face and lean forward. "What's wrong? He still doesn't like you." "My granddaughter is so good looking. Apart from having a strange temper, thick skin, and a strange way of speaking, she doesn't have any other flaws." Yunmu couldn't help but give him a white glance and said, "Old man, you're such a bad person." Mr. Yun snorted and laughed, "If you want me to tell you, you should stay away from that kid Sueyu. He's not like the second son of the Gu family and the kid of the Lu family. He can achieve his current position and has also caused many enemies along the way. That's right, don't have any dealings with that kid anymore. Don't have any dealings with him." Mr. Yun muttered and left on his own. Yunmu lay in bed, his thoughts in a mess. Thinking of what the man in the car had said earlier, he slowly closed his eyes and fell asleep. On the other hand, Sueyu drove back from the Yun family's old mansion to the manor, where his subordinates were already waiting. The group kneeling on the ground was the one who had just surrounded them. Sueyu walked over and looked at the people on the ground like looking at a pile of mud. "Tell me, who gave you the courage?" The people on the ground were strong in spirit, with bloodstains dripping from the corners of their mouths on the ground. "No one, it's just, our boss, you're not happy with it," they said. Sueyu let out a soft snort, his expression getting colder and colder. "You're not feeling good." "I've been feeling a lot of discomfort." "Either hold it back, or I'll kill you with all your discomfort." The man didn't talk much nonsense and gave his subordinates a glance. The person on the ground was dragged away, and in no time even the blood on the ground disappeared, as if nothing had happened just now. Blue 7. A man named Lan Chi approached Sueyu and respectfully lowered his head. "Sir. Have all the people who saw Yunmu cleaned up tonight?" Sueyu frowned. "There's a fish that missed the net, sir. Do you need to catch him back?" Sueyu raised his eyes and said, "No need to scratch. Let's clean up the Baiju gang. There are many people with mixed eyes, so it's useless to keep it." "Yes." Yunmu came out of the hall and didn't know what was wrong with the little old man these past few days. Not only did he cheat on her phone, but he also took her to the tea room all day. Fortunately, he wasn't there today, so he was able to reveal his phone. Just as I opened my phone, I saw a long stream of voice messages from Shen Luoshu. I was about to click on it when her phone rang. Dusk, something's wrong. Shen Luoshu's voice came through the phone, startling her. What's wrong? Sueyu was shot. As soon as Shen Luoshu spoke, Yunmu was taken aback and ran outside the door, inquiring about the situation. It turned out that on the night they returned, the people who surrounded them were from the Baizhu gang. In the past, this Baizhu gang was also considered a local leader, but a few years ago, the Baizhu gang changed its leader and never participated in the fight again. I don't know why they suddenly surrounded Sueyu this time. In a fit of anger, he sent someone to destroy the entire gang. Sueyu accidentally got a bullet and almost hit his heart. Fortunately, he was sent in time, which saved his life. The old man's abnormality in the past few days has been explained, but she wanted to stop her from knowing the news. Naturally, she couldn't let the old man know about her going out. She stopped and finally ran towards the garage. In no time, a dark purple Lamborghini drove out of the garage with a buzzing sound. First hospital, Gu Huijing pointed at Lan Qiqi and said, "He's not in a normal mental state, and you're not in a normal mental state either. If you could hit yourself so hard, besides the one in Xuancheng, only Sueyu, who is crazy, can do it." Lan Qi lowered his head and stood silently, his face full of regret. If he had come back in a timely manner, the gentleman wouldn't have done so. Lu Jiayan, dressed in a white coat, came out of the hospital room, took off his mask, frowned tightly, and said, "All right, don't talk about him anymore. Who knows what kind of temper second brother has." Fortunately, it was delivered on time that day, otherwise his living king of hell would have become a dead one. It's okay, my second brother has a sense of propriety in his actions. Lu Jiayan closed the case. He has a sense of propriety, Gu Huijing couldn't help but curse. In order to lure snakes out of their holes, he doesn't even care about his own life. Lu Jiayan didn't say anything more, and he strongly disapproved of Sueyu's approach of harming the enemy by 1,000 and self-harming by 800. Although the Baizhu gang was just a lure, the one behind the line was a big fish. He had to go to great lengths to make the people behind him think that his life was hanging on the line and relax his vigilance. Fortunately, he caught all the snakes and mice in one fell swoop. Before they could say anything more, they heard footsteps running in the distance. Their petite figure was stopped by several big men before they could get close to the hospital room door. They guessed it was Yunmu, so they called someone to step back. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. You are the one who fears the head and the tail. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. You are the one who fears the head and the tail. The woman was dressed in a long blue dress. Originally, the old man had arranged for her to spend the whole day teaching tea art to students in the tea room. After attending morning classes, she was able to get her phone and then rushed to the hospital without even changing her clothes. Gu Huijing couldn't help but admire the powerful creature of women as he watched her run smoothly in a pair of slim high heels. Without time to take a breath, he gasped for breath and asked Dr. Lu Jiayan, "What about humans? Are they dead or alive?" Lu Jiayan was slightly taken aback, not expecting her to ask like this, with a faint smile on the corner of her mouth. "I've lived for several days, I'm panting inside." She didn't say anything more and nodded before pushing the door in. Before Lan Qi could stop her, the door had already closed. Gu Huijing looked at the show and asked Lan Qi, "Do you want your master to be more mentally alert in the future?" Lan Qi nodded obediently, then shook his head again. The gentleman's mind was fine, he was just seeing that Lan Qi, like his master, had a brain problem. Gu Huijing couldn't help but roll his eyes. Lu Jiayan beside him smiled and said, "Then remember, if there is someone who can make your master's mind clear, besides Yunmu, no one else can have this ability. However, there is one more important thing." "What?" Gu Huijing exchanged a glance with Lu Jiayan and continued, not only can it make your master sober, but it can also make your master go crazy completely. Remember, when Sueyu dies, you must give him a hand. When he wakes up, he will definitely thank you. After speaking, the two of them left with a smile. Only Lan Qi is left with some uncertainty about his mind. As soon as Yunmu entered, she saw that the hospital bed was empty, frowning and wondering. She turned her head to look at the tall figure in front of the window. The man leaned against the window, one hand inserted into his suit pocket, the other holding a cigarette, his upper body naked, and a white bandage wrapped around his chest. The muscle lines on his arms appeared to be hormonally stimulated, and this time he finally saw the black tattoo on his body. The Buddha statue that occupied half of his arm was haloed around, with a snake coiled around his forearm, its head spitting out snake letters on its wrist, and a string of numbers tattooed on its body, which looked like a date. Yunmu was so angry when he saw him smoking despite being injured. He strode over and threw the cigarette from his hand to the ground, while also twirling it with his foot. You really don't hesitate at all. Yunmu looked at him coldly. Sueyu let out a nonchalant moan and looked at the woman glaring at him. Do you think someone like me would be afraid of death? Yunmu, I don't have the time or energy to play house games with you. Getting injured is not a big deal. If you can't bear it this time, then I advise you to stay away from me as soon as possible. I can't give you what you want. What you thought of me before was just an illusion. Don't be fooled by that extremely bad and ruthless businessman in the population, it's me. Sueyu continued speaking without intending to give her a chance to digest. Apart from indifference, there was no other emotion in her eyes. Yunmu listened to what he said without showing any inappropriate behavior, except for the red eyes that exposed her current mood. She never cares about what others say, she only believes what she feels. Sueyu is not that kind of person. She doesn't like him belittling himself so much, but she also doesn't like him pushing himself away like this. Sueyu watched the woman run out with red eyes. This time it was different from last time, and it really hurt her. Instead of getting stuck in it and unable to get out in the future, it's better to tell her earlier that there is still room for choice. To his surprise, the woman who left crying half an hour ago still returned to the hospital room with red eyes half an hour later. Yunmu carried a bag of things into the room, and without looking at the man standing by, he took out the congee vegetables from the bag and put them on the table. She was really angry, both angry at Sueyu for saying those words mercilessly and angry at herself for not knowing how to move forward at all. She had originally intended to drive away, but sitting in the car felt like she couldn't give up. How could he know that he was on a whim? How can he conclude that he won't always like him? After arranging everything, she walked up to Sueyu and stared straight at him. I don't know what I can say to believe it. I like you and want to be with you. It's not a joke, it's not a whim. Why do you always think of pushing me away? Isn't it good for me to be with you? I am not afraid of what you said, and I can accept any consequences. It is you who cannot accept these consequences, and it is you who are afraid of accidents. You, Sueyu, are the one who fears both the head and the tail. Sueyu looked at the woman with a firm face, even though her eyes were red, he couldn't lose in terms of aura. Just as he was about to speak, she refuted him. Don't say it yet, let me say it. This time, Sueyu. If you continue to push me far away and threaten me with those words, I really won't come back. After speaking, she seemed to be afraid that Sueyu would say anything more to chase her, so she immediately sat back on the sofa, picked up chopsticks, and started eating. I'm hungry, I don't want to hear anything anymore. You must be hungry too. I can't eat, you understand. Looking at the woman's refusal to communicate, Sueyu finally didn't say anything and sat down with her. In the following days, as soon as dawn broke, Yunmu would appear in the ward on time with breakfast. Apart from brewing tea, she only had culinary skills that were commendable. Miss Yun, sir is discharged today. Lan Qi looked at the woman who walked in carrying a lunchbox. Well, I know. She placed the lunchbox on the table. Don't worry, my life doesn't revolve around him 24 hours a day. Lan Qi nodded, but he still felt that the statement was not quite accurate. As soon as Yunmu sat on the sofa, he heard the sound of someone speaking at the door. Next time, take it lightly. Although it's just a show, there's no need to be so realistic. This shot is almost irreparable. The door was opened, and Yunmu looked at Sui Yu and Lu Jiayan who walked in. The two of them had no surprise that she appeared here. It took a lot of effort for a Ning to eat the food you cooked before, and I didn't expect someone to have such good taste. Lu Jiayan smiled and glanced back and forth between the two. Yunmu pretended to sigh and shook his head. Unfortunately, someone is in the midst of good fortune and doesn't know it. Sui Yu raised his eyebrows without hesitation. Lu Jiayan gave a few more words of advice before leaving. As soon as the person left, Yunmu ignored Sui Yu and stood at the door, enjoying breakfast on his own. The doctor advised that the 3 meals a day should be light, and the breakfast these days is almost all plain congee and side dishes without changing the soup and dressing. Sui Yu looked at the woman who refused to communicate. Her furrowed brows slowly loosened, thinking that she was still angry about last night's incident, perhaps so angry that she would scold him a few times at home, which was very interesting. Although he doesn't have a smoking habit, his activities have been limited to the ward these days. His diet has become light, and there are still a bunch of documents waiting for him to sign at work. Last night, as soon as the woman entered the ward, she saw piles of documents and several burnt cigarette butts in the ashtray. She wasn't in a hurry either, she just put some news of sudden death from work in his ear, sighing regretfully while shaking her head and saying, "It's a pity that I lost my life at a young age due to work. I went to the King of Hell and they asked, 'How did you die?' Ah, it's nothing. I just love my job too much. I accidentally ruined my job and lost my life. So, the King of Hell is willing to listen to this. Oh, come on, we have another free labor force. Don't worry about your performance this year." When the conversation turned around, the woman looked at her with a smile and said, "Is that right? Lord Yen? Are you going to visit your hometown?" Sui Yu's hand paused as he signed, perfectly drawing a long arc. This character was neither written nor not written. Yunmu was very satisfied when he saw that he was feeling exhausted. He reached out and patted his shoulder, then stood up and said, "Keep working, work hard. Otherwise, the waste people your company raises who can't leave you will be anxious and can't be left to rot." After speaking, he left without looking back. After a night, no one could tell that she was still angry. Sui Yu was clear about it, and Yunmu showed all her emotions on her face without hiding anything. She never disdained to hide her emotions, which was exactly the opposite of Sui Yu. Yunmu looked at the food she had cooked on the table, and for an instant, she felt a bit confused. Since meeting Sui Yu, she seemed to have become different from herself. The once free and unrestrained Yunmu has now given up on the sky of freedom. The key is that she still doesn't appreciate it, and she is a bit confused about whether her actions are right or not. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Surface and Reality. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6 Surface and Reality. Until the discharge was completed, Yunmu didn't say a few more words to him. Lan Qi was a bit puzzled by the atmosphere between the two, and remembered what Gu Huijing and Lu Jiayan had told him. At the risk of his life, he decided to break the awkwardness at this moment. "Miss Yun, where are you planning to go next? Let the driver give you a ride, right?" Lan Qi accompanied his smiling face, trying to ignore the teacher's direct gaze, and persisted. In the future, the teacher will definitely thank him. Yunmu glanced at Sui Yu, who was indifferent, through the elevator mirror and took a deep breath. "No need, I drove here," he said after eating a little. Lan Qi could only nod in a casual manner. Is there anyone more difficult to do than him? Neither side is a fuel-efficient lamp. The driver had already driven the car to the entrance of the hospital, and Sui Yu's footsteps on the car paused for a moment. Thinking of what Gu Huijing had said before, he turned to Yunmu who was about to leave and said, "Be careful when driving, there shouldn't be any rural ditches here." After speaking, without waiting for Yunmu to react, he sat directly in the car and looked at the bulging face of the person standing in the original place through the window, with a smile on his lips. Lan Qi got into the car and saw that his owner was a bit different. The more he looked like him. "It's already summer, isn't spring already over?" Before he could figure it out, he was scared by a glance from Sui Yu and turned his head. Blue 7. Lan Qi, who was named, was startled and said, "Yes, sir. Have I been different from before lately?" "No. Sir, you are still as tall and powerful as before, with a strong aura. How dare you make unauthorized claims, then?" The gaze behind him was like a knife, invisibly piercing countless holes in his body. Lan Qi felt like he was about to gasp for breath, but fortunately, this kind of Ling Qi didn't last long. Let's not take it as an example. I remember there was a project in South Africa that nobody took over, you know. Sui Yu's tone was flat, as if discussing today's weather. "There's absolutely no next time, sir. Lan Qi has a feeling of surviving a disaster. This kind of work is not something that ordinary people can do. Next time, he must not be brainwashed by Mr. Gu and Mr. Lu. It is still important to have a small life." Thinking that I had just taken out my driver's license and was driving to play, I didn't expect a duck to suddenly run away on the road. I was so scared that I didn't react for a moment. As I turned the steering wheel to the left and turned the brake to the accelerator, I heard a buzzing sound and the car plunged into a dry ditch on the roadside. Thinking of the only eyewitness at the scene, Yunmu immediately made a phone call. "Hey, Miss Yun, what's up?" "Gu Huijing, who else did you tell me about driving?" Gu Huijing pretended to think and said, "There's no one, just those from Xuancheng and Fucheng. Of course, I haven't forgotten those from Yanqing either." Upon hearing his words, Yunmu held his breath in his throat and couldn't get up or down. In the end, he gritted his teeth and forcefully held back his breath, saying, "Gu, don't hold on to my hand one day. Otherwise, I won't make you cry, Dad or Mom." After finishing this sentence with a fierce aura, Yunmu heard even more brazen laughter on the other end of the phone. His anger immediately subsided and he let out a cold snort. He stopped talking about the previous topic and spoke with a slightly sinister tone, "Mr. Gu, have you found the place I asked you to help me find a few days ago?" Upon hearing this, Gu Huijing changed his tone and appeared somewhat flattering, with goosebumps all over his body. "Of course I found it. Mr. Gu, I can't be more reliable in handling things." "That's okay, you can send me the address and I'll go over and take a look. If there's no problem, I'll just finalize it." Gu Huai nodded at the scenic spot and realized that she couldn't see it. She said to the phone, "Okay, I'll be with you." "No need, just keep yourself busy." Gu Huijing was a bit puzzled. The land she was looking for was not small. "What are you planning on doing?" "I plan to open a tea plantation. In recent years, tea culture has flourished, and now young people are also beginning to like the activity of drinking tea. Coincidentally, I don't want to be under the old man's nose at home, so he won't be able to lecture me." Gu Huijing understands that although Yunmu has become increasingly rebellious in recent years, he has not let down Yun Laozi's teachings in family inheritance. Moreover, Yunmu is genuinely interested in tea culture, otherwise he would not have been immersed in tea houses since childhood. According to the address provided by Gu Huijing, she drove for an hour to the location, which was just right from the city center and the surrounding environment was not noisy. She glanced inside and only needed to find a designer to modify it later. It was still very in line with Yunmu's requirements, and without further hesitation, she negotiated the price with the agent and directly signed a contract to buy it. In the next few days, besides being busy with the decoration of the tea house, Yunmu also had to go back to the Yun family and select some students to hire them to the tea house. Mr. Yun was very happy that Yunmu could do this. He selected a few of his most satisfied disciples and sent them to the tea house together. I am very proud that Miss Yun has the heart to inherit tea culture. If you have any questions, just let me know at home and I will fully support you. After hearing these words, Yunmu immediately smiled and held his hands forward, flattering him, "Grandpa, I still lack funds. Don't you show me that." Although very speechless, Mr. Yun, who had already spoken, could only reach out of his pocket and wave his hand, giving her several $1,000,000 in credit. Finally, she reminded her, "This belongs to investing. I can't put it in your pocket." Y Group Gu Huijing has been working here for half an hour now, but the person behind the desk hasn't even looked. I said, "Mr. Sui, can we take a break?" Suiyu looked up and glanced at him, but his hand movements still didn't stop. "Are you here just to prevent me from working?" "Of course not." Gu Huijing walked forward and handed him his phone, pointing to the photo inside. "The person you asked me to help you check before, my person found his figure at Xuanqing Airport yesterday. Are you sure it's him?" Suiyu saw a man in black, wearing a hat and mask in the surveillance screenshot. Gu Huijing hugged his chest with both hands and sat on his desk, hissing, "Coincidentally, my people didn't notice him at first." Speaking, as soon as he looked up, he saw Suiyu staring straight at him. Gu Huijing rubbed his nose and got off his desk, honestly landing on the chair. He continued, "But this kid may have been sneaking around for the first time, and he happened to meet my people, but..." He paused for a moment and looked at Suiyu. Suiyu calmly leaned back and continued, "However, he still managed to escape, and someone was secretly helping him." Gu Huijing raised his eyebrows and nodded. "You're such a half-brother, you can't be underestimated." Gu Huijing's eyes were somewhat complicated. He knew the family of Suiyu the best, and it was because of this that he felt unworthy of her. "Since it's in Xuanqing, there's no need to worry." Suiyu returned his phone to Gu Huijing. Gu Huai nodded at the scenic spot and said, "Yes, even with the one from Xuanqing, he can't make a splash." After discussing the matter, Suiyu was planning to continue working, but Gu Huijing had some thoughts on it. "Aren't you curious why the girl Yunmu hasn't been looking for you lately?" Gu Huijing looked playfully. "Do you know that a person's words in this lifetime are limited?" said Suiyu, placing the newly signed contract aside and sealing it with a pen cap. Now Gu Huijing felt a bit confused and looked at him in confusion. "What does that mean?" "If you finish speaking limited words, you're also finished." Gu Huijing ignored his words and continued with the previous topic, saying, "She has been keeping an eye on the construction of the tea house recently, but it has ended now. It is estimated that it will officially open in a while. Don't forget to go then." Tea house. Gu Huai nodded at the scenic spot and said, "Although Yunmu has rebelled a bit, she is still very responsible for inheriting the Yun family tea ceremony. After all the efforts of Mr. Yun are on her." Suiyu knew that Mr. Yun was famous for his love for his granddaughter. "I've always heard that she's the only one in the Yun family, so naturally all the burden falls on her." "You don't know that, do you?" Gu Huijing thought of Yunmu's mischievous and decent face. "Don't you think this girl may seem free and easy on the surface, but in reality, she can hide things better than anyone else? Everyone knows that she was raised by Mr. Yun himself, but no one knows about the Yun couple. Back then, Yunmu's father fell in love with a woman, but he was beaten by Yun Laozi and forced to marry the daughter of Song's Bank, Yunmu's mother. After marriage, the two were not happy. After Yunmu was born, Yunmu's father left Yunshi and has not returned yet. Micah blamed Yunmu for all of this mistake. When she was 6 years old, she stood alone in the ice and snow, freezing her body until Yun Laozi found out about it, take Yunmu back and raise him personally. In a few years, Yunmu's mother committed suicide due to depression. That's why she still visits the temple once a month, even though she doesn't care about anything and has no desires or requests. She believes that everything is her fault, and she doesn't want to disappoint Mr. Yun or let the Yun family decline to take on all the responsibilities. She has always believed that if she doesn't hit the south wall, she won't turn back, but she is also ruthless. After Gu Huijing left, the office returned to a quiet appearance. Sui Yu stood by the French window. He felt the powerlessness of being trampled on the soil, but eventually he became the role of overlooking all living beings. He thought that everything would be under his control, at least not deviate from the channel. Sui Yu, you can't say too much, and you can't do things too absolutely. There are always some facts that you can't control. Yunmu has a free and unrestrained attitude, but you don't. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Opening Storm. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7 Opening Storm. The tea house opened in mid-August and Yunmu didn't like the hustle and bustle, so he abandoned the opening ceremony. However, with the speed of Gu Huijing spread, everyone knows that today is the first day of operation for Yunmu Tea House. While dealing with the people she interacted with, most of whom were acquaintances in her circle, she silently cursed Gu Huijing millions of times in her heart. Some of those who didn't have time today also congratulated her on WeChat and started making reservations in advance. Song Xian was the person she had chosen from the old man, so she could be considered top-notch. Yunmu entrusted her with the operation of the tea house and even gave her preventive shots in advance. You don't have to worry, there won't be many people, at most, 2 days off and 1 day off, she said. But now, as Song Xian looked at the appointments on her iPad that had already been scheduled for a month later, she silently walked up to Yunmu, who had finally been available, and handed her the full set of appointments in her hand. Boss, are you still on 2 days off and 1 day off? Yunmu stared intently at the crowded appointments and cursed Gu Huijing in his heart. He forced a smile and said, young people, don't just think about rest. Of course, great youth is for work. Song Xian silently took the big cake drawn by the boss again. She was only 21 years old and a child who had to report to her parents when going out to play. Yunmu stood for more than an hour and finally wanted to sit down and rest. Before her buttocks could warm up, an employee rushed over to tell her that something had happened. Her mind is buzzing with sunflower seeds now, and at this moment, she feels like her temples are about to explode. When she rushed over, she saw Song Xian bowing her head, her tearful face clearly visible with palm marks. Yunmu looked at the person sitting beside her with high toes and an air of pride, and immediately understood what was going on. She walked over and pulled Song Xian, who was frozen in place, behind her, then raised a standard polite smile and looked at the man sitting in the chair. Mr. Jiang, this is my first day of business. If there are any shortcomings, please bear with me, but I see on my employee's face. I did it. Mr. Jiang raised his hand and gestured, I've heard that Yun's tea art is unparalleled. It seems like it's just that today. I don't think your shabby restaurant will last long. On the side, Song Xian heard that Mr. Jiang was reversing black and white, and her heart was even more anxious. Her face turned red with anger, and tears in her eyes were like uncontrollable water. She sobbed and pointed at Mr. Jiang, even though you touched me up and down, I didn't let you, you hit me. But now you're reversing black and white. Upon hearing this, Mr. Jiang slammed his big hand onto the table and glared fiercely at Song Xian, what kind of thing are you? I can see that you are your lucky one. I tell you, even if I ask your boss to pour tea, she wouldn't dare to say a word. Song Xian was about to refute, but Yunmu reached out to stop her. At this moment, her smile had already disappeared from her face. Under the gaze of everyone, Yunmu slowly pulled open the chair next to her and sat directly opposite Mr. Jiang. With her right hand, she held a hot pot of boiling water and warmed the cup, poured tea, washed tea, brewed tea, made soup, and divided the tea. She did it calmly and smoothly, making people unable to help but be mesmerized. Mr. Jiang's face was immediately filled with a smile, look, even the Yun family has to personally pour me tea. After finishing speaking, he reached out to pick up the tea cup handed over by Yunmu. Before he could even touch the tea body, the woman dodged her hand and the tea was hard spilled on the ground. The loud noise stimulated everyone present, including Mr. Jiang, who had a stiff smile on his face. Mr. Jiang gasped for breath and suddenly stood up to point at Yunmu. Before he could say a word, Yunmu stood up and threw the cup straight at him, hitting the bridge of his nose. Mr. Jiang grinned in pain, throwing it at the person with all her strength. The huge impact made Mr. Jiang's nose slightly red. Everyone was stunned by the dramatic change, and no one dared to step forward. Yunmu threw the water stain on his hand, slightly tilted his head, and looked arrogantly at Mr. Jiang across from him. His gaze was as if he was looking at a pile of mud that couldn't support the wall. Yunmu. How dare you treat me like this? A broken Yunshi is just a weak and old family, guarding a feudal and backward culture, feeling so clean. Mr. Jiang pointed at Yunmu and cursed loudly, acting like a street-scolding thug. Yunmu's gaze was like a rapidly changing weather, changing from sunny to cloudy. Unlike Sui Yu's ferocity, her gaze seemed to strip the person across from her alive. Jiang Tsong, you may have forgotten that Yun never provokes trouble, but I, Yunmu, have never taken these things seriously. Jiang Tsong suddenly realized that the Yunmu he had provoked was not a soft persimmon like the Yun family. In the entire Yen city, there was a man named Sui Yu, whose background was too deep and his methods were fierce, and no one dared to touch his eyebrows. A woman named Yunmu is a rebellious fairy born from an elegant family. She never disdains what others dare to do, and she never fails to do what others dare not. She is like a seemingly obedient little fox. When you are deceived by her appearance and relax your guard one day, she will unknowingly make you die. He thought that Yunmu was just a bluff. How could Yunshi really allow her to act recklessly outside? You, what can you do to me? My Jiang family is not so easy to deal with. Is that so? How annoying is it? A calm male voice reached everyone's ears, and Yunmu's body stiffened. It was not necessary to wonder who the owner of the voice was. The man was dressed in a black suit, with a different hairstyle from before. He combed his hair back and exposed his forehead, with sword eyebrows and starry eyes. His dark pupils were like a deep abyss of darkness, with a kind of attraction that always sucked people in. His eyes were full of indifference, and the aura around him made people shy away. When Jiang Tsong saw the newcomer, he was already too scared to move. His father ordered him to spend the whole afternoon telling him that the person in front of him, Sui Yu, was even more troublesome than the second master of the Gu family. However, he was indeed unable to connect Sui Yu and Yunmu, who were completely unrelated. Yunmu glanced at him and then shifted his gaze uneasily, coughing lightly. Why are you here? Congratulations. Yunmu was somewhat surprised by this answer. She thought that Sui Yu wouldn't join in the fun, so she naturally didn't tell him about the opening of the tea house. Coincidentally, I have someone to meet up with. Sui Yu's simple and straightforward answer made Yunmu feel something different. Jiang Tsong, who had not yet regained his senses, was secretly taken away by his family's bodyguards. However, before a few people could leave the room, he was stopped by Sui Yu and stood in place. I don't know if Jiang knows that Xiaojiang has such a great reputation outside. Sui Yu's tone was cold, making it hard to hear joy or anger, but it was precisely because of this that everyone felt a shiver, like a piercing cold wind blowing in the cold winter. Jiang Tsong's heart trembled, and his constantly blinking eyes exposed the fear in his heart at this moment. The Yun family has always been a place that many families dare not disturb. Mr. Xiaojiang's words about feudalism and backwardness may not be referring to himself. Let Mr. Jiang know what you have done to the future successor of the Yun family today, and he may not be able to drink it with just one sip of tea, and even if he spits it out, he will have to hold it in a golden bowl. What is precious is that sip of tea, not just your Jiang surname. Sui Yu's words made everyone present feel uneasy, not only grateful that they did not become as arrogant as Jiang Tsong and provoke the Yun family. Jiang Tsong's face turned pale from crimson, but he was powerless to refute Sui Yu's words. He was just a pervert who had gone to the brain today and didn't even manage it. Now, he just wanted to quickly turn this matter over. Yes, today's incident is that Jiang didn't use his brain. Please forgive me, Mr. Sui. Sui Yu frowned and didn't want to say a word to this brainless thing anymore. Lan Qi, who was standing beside him, saw the impatient appearance of the teacher and promptly stood up to remind Jiang Kong. Mr. Xiaojiang, it's not our husband who deserves your apology. Jiang Tsong was taken aback for a moment, reflexively looking at Yunmu. Even if his eyes were unwilling, there was nothing he could do. If it weren't for it, Miss Yun, it was Jiang who offended me today. Please raise your hand, Miss Yun. After speaking, the scene fell into silence for a moment, and no one responded for a long time. Sui Yu was not in a hurry, quite at ease, but Jiang Tsong on one side couldn't make up his mind. Just as he was about to speak again, he heard a female voice. All visitors are guests. Today's event is a misunderstanding, but my employee's face has been beaten and tears have fallen. I'm afraid she has some shadow in her heart. After all, this is a person taught by the old man in the family. If something happens, how can I tell the old man? In this case, let's take a step back. Mental loss fee plus medical expenses, money should be paid to President Jiang. A total of 478, which is very lucky. Jiang always swipes his card, cash or WeChat Alipay. Small shop operation, welcome Mr. Jiang to come and consume again. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Don't worry about it. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Don't worry about it. Sui Yu watched as she stared at the money received on her phone, laughing incessantly. For a moment, she didn't know if the rumored message that Yunmu didn't bow down for money was incorrect. What are you doing? Yunmu looked up and saw him staring at the phone in her hand. The attraction of money made her not stop it for a moment. She immediately carried the phone behind her and looked back with a thief-proof gaze, with a hint of suspicion and caution in her eyes. The still hot money she had just received needed to be protected. By the way, it's already fully booked today, and there's no private room left. Yunmu paused and tried to conceal the pride that flashed in his eyes. However, I also kept a private room for personal use, which is the largest and best private room here. I won't arrange it for anyone else, but it doesn't matter unless it's an old lady. Sui Yu looked at the woman's smile that couldn't be suppressed at the corner of her mouth, and the pride in her eyes was like a cunning fox getting grapes. You can watch the arrangements. The man threw down a sentence and walked out, leaving Yunmu couldn't help but feel happy in the same place. His proud little eyes stared at the man's tall back. Sui Yu, admit it, you are different from me. The tea house is divided into 3 levels, with only 12 private rooms in total. The lobby is completely hollowed out from the first to the 3rd floor, and she has set up a stage, vividly imitating the style of ancient theaters. She loves the antique style very much, sipping a cup of tea and listening to a little song makes her feel extremely relaxed. After Sui Yu finished discussing business, it was already 5:30 p.m. Yunmu placed the tea leaves perfectly, set up the tea cup, and then looked up at the man sitting in the chair, closing his eyes and recuperating. The sunlight shone through the screen window and hit him, as if coated with a layer of golden light. She immediately remembered the tattoo on Sui Yu's arm. Sui Yu, I haven't had lunch yet. Upon hearing this, Sui Yu opened her eyes and saw her holding her cheek with one hand in front of him, staring at him without blinking. As he looked over, she blinked falsely twice, with inexplicable grievances in her eyes. I'll treat you to dinner, or you can treat me, thank you, Mr. Sui, she said on her own, her eyes flickering with agility, attracting Sui Yu's attention. Sui Yu chuckled lightly, like melted ice and snow. In an instant, Yunmu couldn't move her eyes. At this point, you don't find me bored anymore. The man's words brought her to her senses, and she sat up straight with a smile on her face as she looked at him. I talk more, you talk less, we complement each other perfectly. In the end, Yunmu was unable to arrange a meal with Suiyu as he had hoped. It can only be said that Mr. Yun's timely phone call was like hitting a mandarin duck with a stick. Yunmu parked the car in front of the Yun family's door, threw the key in her hand to the butler on the side, and before she could say anything, she quickly disappeared without a trace. It wasn't until she saw the little old man leisurely drinking tea in the main hall that she realized she had been tricked by this person. Taking 2 steps together, the clattering sound of the high heels is enough to prove how powerful the owner of the shoes is walking at this moment. Old man, you said you're so old, why can't you just take a break? Almost tonight you'll be able to hold a man back. Yunmu slapped the bag in her hand onto the mahogany table, pacing back and forth uncontrollably, trying to dispel her frustration. She should have a clearer mind, otherwise she would have been deceived by the butler's phone call, saying that the old man was heartbroken and couldn't breathe. In her opinion, she felt the most heartbroken in her heart. It was not easy to wait until Suiyu finally let go, but such a good opportunity was missed. You're a big yellow flower girl, you don't feel ashamed to say these things. Mr. Yun put down his tea bowl, frowned, and his face was full of dissatisfaction, thinking to himself which step was wrong. Why is this little girl different from others? You little girl, you haven't caused trouble for me since I was young. How come the girl from the Shen family is so well behaved, the Tan family is cute and agile, the Li family is likable, and the Hua family is even more stable? Why is it that we, the Yun family, are so different? Mr. Yun couldn't figure it out, his eyes full of doubts and self-doubt. Is it because his education method is wrong? No, this girl was born to make him worry. You're okay with that, Yunmu said with a burst of energy, full of blood, as soon as he heard these words. Look, Grandpa Shen is the son of the pear garden, and his style is quite accurate. Grandpa Tan has a smart mind and has built such a big foundation. Grandpa Li passed away early, but he was also a national-level singer back then. Although Grandpa Hua may not have much ability, he can't resist his good fortune and a family full of descendants. Look at you again, do you know what your greatest strength is? What? It's possible to have a granddaughter like me who is so beautiful and intelligent. Mr. Yun didn't swallow a sip of tea and choked in his throat, causing his face to turn red. Cough, 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 you're not filial. You didn't listen to my surname before telling jokes. This is taking my life, he said. Yunmu rolled his big eyes and walked over, patting the old man's back with his hand, slowly giving him a smooth ride. I said you called me back just to argue with me. Mr. Yun turned his head and glared at her, straightened his waist, breathed a sigh of relief, and said, I heard that the Jiang family caused trouble in the tea house today. Yunmu was not surprised at all, as if she had anticipated that she would be asked about this matter. After seeing the old man's expression ease, she turned around and sat on the chair closest to him. Your old news is also fast. I guess something has just happened on my end, so you should know now. She straightened the hem of her skirt and leaned leisurely on the chair. With a glance, the old man took a leisurely sip of tea. Don't blame me for meddling in you, you have a good temper and are the easiest to suffer losses. Yunmu remained silent, and the old man continued, you don't need to pay attention to the Jiang family's matter, I'll handle it. How do you handle it? Dragging your half-aged body to the Jiang family to complain. Yunmu frowned tightly, feeling an indescribable annoyance in his heart, and even more angry at the old man's words. I'm not that kid anymore. I can't solve this small matter yet. It's been a waste of years. Besides, you underestimate your granddaughter too much. Mr. Yun looked at Yunmu and saw the figure of a little girl in front of him. Indeed, the little girl from that time had grown into a big girl and had her own ideas. Miss Yun, it's Grandpa's fault. If it weren't for back then. Before he could finish speaking, Yunmu interrupted him with a cold face. "Stop talking about those old and rotten millet things. I don't even remember them. You should just drink tea honestly, don't worry about what you shouldn't do." After speaking, Yunmu didn't give the old man a chance to speak. He stood up and waved his hand, saying nothing, carrying his bag and walking out. "Hey, why are you going again? It's so late." "Don't worry." Mr. Yun shook his head as he watched his figure gradually recede, unable to control it. According to the information provided by Tan Kuning, Yunmu drove all the way to the largest entertainment venue in Yancheng, also known as a nightclub. "Before I could walk in, I was stopped by 2 bodyguards at the door. I have long heard that the rules here are strict, and without the introduction of the people inside, it is impossible to enter." She picked up her phone and showed the letter sent by Tan Kenning to the 2 of them. The latter glanced at it, nodded, and respectfully pushed open the door. The dazzling lights, deafening music, and colorful attire, for the sake of everyone's privacy, as long as you enter here, everyone must wear a mask. Dusk, this was obtained from my brother. I have inquired and found out that Jiang Song comes here every night. I have arranged for everyone inside. You just need to go in and find a man wearing a blue suit, and he will take you to Jiang Song's place. Yunmu's eyes swept back and forth from the crowd, and her final gaze was fixed on the blue suit man next to the bar. She changed into a silver sequin camisole dress, with long wavy hair scattered behind her, resembling a woman's swaying figure. Her high heels with black straps stepped on the expensive carpet. A silver mask with smoky makeup and red lips that covers half of the face. The man in the suit looked at Yunmu approaching and couldn't move his eyes for a moment, until the other person's dissatisfied gaze came over, and then suddenly regained his senses. "Miss Yun, Sister Tan has already told me that Xiaojiang is always a member here and has an exclusive personal private room located in the 6th room on the 2nd floor. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. As the largest entertainment venue in Yancheng, visitors to Qianlu must be either wealthy or wealthy. Entering the entrance of Qianlu is like stepping into the upper circle, with luxury cars parked one after another outside the entrance. Yunmu had just walked up the spiral staircase to the 2nd floor when a semi-drunk man met her. Coincidentally, he saw Yunmu walking up and without saying a word, he reached out to her with both hands. Following the principle of not having too much to do, Yunmu was about to maneuver around when the man in the blue suit arrived in time. As he moved the half-drunk man's hand away from her, he said to her, "Miss Yun, there is no one here who is easy to deal with. You should be careful." Yunmu nodded, afraid to stay even though time was tight. She followed the corridor all the way to the room where Jiang Song was located. Before she came, she had already asked Tan Kenning to help investigate. The Jiang family has indeed collected a lot of money here and there over the years, but although everyone seems to be unaware on the surface, their hearts are clear. However, these stolen goods have disappeared completely, which inevitably raises suspicion. The opponents of the Jiang family hesitated because of this, unable to find any evidence of the Jiang family, and also envious of their endless financial opportunities. Yunmu took the fruit platter given by the service guy, held it on the door handle, and pushed it open. The woman under the mask couldn't help but frown as she couldn't bear to enter. I saw Jiang Song hugging left and right, with only a few pieces of fabric covering the women around him. Jiang Song's unfaithful gaze swept up and down, and Yunmu quickly scanned the faces of several women, all of whom had the most obvious feature. Blurred eyes, flushed complexion, and stiff body. She looked around the whole room in the remaining light, with a bodyguard standing on one side of the door. Yunmu quietly gripped the hand holding a fine needle under the fruit tray, and she could see that her strength could not defeat the 2 large figures standing at the door. Jiang Song was still very cautious, as these 2 bodyguards had received professional training and could not be compared to the weak chickens he brought during the day. Jiang Song's gaze shifted away from his female companion beside him, and he noticed the woman standing in front of him. The short skirt with a camisole could cover his thighs, and a pair of slender and long beautiful legs were exposed before his eyes. He could tell how soft the touch was without looking at the bulging of his chest. His slender hands held fruit plates, and although half of his face was covered by a mask, he could read countless experiences of the woman and guess how beautiful the face under the mask was. Yunmu pretended to bend over and place the fruit tray on the coffee table, but as she expected, her hand was grabbed by the man in the next second. Beauty, new here. Even wealthy children like Jiang Tsong, who lack knowledge and skills and achieve nothing, still carry exploration and distrust in any stranger who appears in Qianlu. Yunmu nodded lightly, took a small step forward, pretended to be tripped by something, let out a coquettish cry, and fell onto the man's lap. The fruit in the fruit tray fell out, and the red dragon fruit slid down her skirt, leaving traces of red juice on her fair and smooth skin. Beauty, just so eager. This action clearly pleased Jiang Tsong. Even though he suspected that the woman was intentional, the man could withstand a beautiful woman sliding into his arms, and it was also a brainless teddy dog like Jiang Kong. After speaking, the man extended his big hand towards her chest and said solemnly, "This good fruit can't be wasted. Let me help you eat it, young master." Under the mask, she looked coldly at the hand getting closer to her chest, almost a few centimeters away. Her hand, which had originally wrapped around the man's neck, quickly reached out from under the fruit platter, and a fine needle pierced her neck with precision. Jiang Tsong's face changed, and he looked at the woman in front of him with a fierce expression. He stood up and forcefully threw the person in his arms out. Yunmu's body smashed against the coffee table in front of her, and the huge impact caused her to experience a sharp pain in her chest. Even her breathing was so painful that she gritted her teeth. "Damn it, do you dare to plot against me? You!" Before Jiang Tsong could finish speaking, he felt dizzy in front of him. In just a few seconds, he collapsed limply. Despite this, the exposed women around him still looked at Jiang Tsong lying on the ground with unusual confusion, as if they had no time to react to everything around them. To be precise, they had no idea what had happened, except for one woman who looked at Yunmu with a somewhat surprised gaze. The bodyguard at the door quickly lifted Jiang Tsong off the ground and placed him on the sofa, while another forcefully grabbed Yunmu's neck. The forceful palm quickly turned her face red, and Yunmu forcefully broke the bodyguard's hand outwards with one hand. However, in the face of absolute force, there was nothing to do. With the other hand, she touched the overturned bottle and then used all her strength to smash it towards the bodyguard's head. With a loud bang, the wine bottle immediately burst, and bright red blood dripped down Yunmu's face. Glass shards scratched small bloodstains from her collarbone and exposed arms. The black-clad bodyguard covered the bleeding wound, and his undulating chest was enough to prove his current mood. With the departure of her big hand, Yunmu breathed in the air, struggling to get up from the coffee table while being wary of the two people in front of her. She tightly grasped the half-broken wine bottle in her hand. With a sudden bang, the bodyguard, who had already blossomed on his head, fell straight down and hit the floor heavily. Not only Yunmu, but also another black-clad bodyguard remained unnoticed. She looked at the woman holding a golden golf club in her right hand, and immediately recognized that she was the one sitting on Jiang Tsong's right as soon as she entered the door. The dramatic transformation made Yunmu a bit puzzled, but it was obvious that the woman in front of her was much more powerful. The tall and powerful bodyguard was beaten a few times and couldn't stand up on the ground. In the end, he fainted, while the woman in front of him was unharmed. Yunmu bent over to support his waist and nodded weakly at her. "Who are you?" The woman did not immediately answer her, but took off the earrings on her ears, took a photo of the scene in front of her, and then brought the earrings back to her ears. She just looked at Yunmu. "Hello Miss Yun, I'm Xia. I can't stay here too long. The noise is too loud to attract others' attention." Xia's face was heavily adorned with makeup, and her raised eyelids made her look aggressive. Her red lips were pursed straight, and her eyes showed no emotion. Her straight long hair was tied into a low bald head, and she had a standard oval face with a few strands of broken hair on both sides, exuding a strong goddess of beauty. End of this chapter. Why don't you come and see me in chapter 10? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Why don't you come and see me in chapter 10? Yunmu suppressed the piercing pain in her chest and followed in the footsteps of Shirxia. Outside the private room, there was still a lively and noisy scene, and under the colorful lights, everyone's faces were filled with intoxicated expressions. Just as the two of them had just walked to the entrance of the Qianlu, they heard a cry of surprise from behind. Ah! Hurry up and call the police. A minor rib fracture, no other issues. Lu Jiayan looked at the woman lying in bed, her glass cut wound already coated with ointment. Going to rob. Yunmu was so painful that he couldn't breathe. He frowned tightly and said, "It's almost like robbing Qianlu." Lu Jiayan raised his eyebrows. Even though he already knew Yunmu's ability to ascend to heaven and earth, he did not expect to be so bold. Behind the Qianlu, it's not just the Jiang family. Lu Jiayan closed the case in his hand and spoke calmly. Do you know? As soon as she asked, she immediately felt that the question seemed somewhat unnecessary. Ordinary people didn't know what Lu Jiayan was. They grew up together, but they were very clear. The Lu family started off as a gangster, and even if they later washed their hands, everyone couldn't call Lu Yi when they saw Lu Jiayan. Surprisingly, Lu Jiayan gave up his family business and plunged into the medical industry. Lu Jiayan turned his head to look at Shirxia waiting on the side. Sui Yu has had eyeliner for 2 years. Today, for your sake, it is also exposed. The conversation turned, but it is not without gains. The videos recorded by Shirxia are enough for the Jiang family to avoid the limelight for a while. After all, X-trading is an illegal and criminal act. After listening, Yunmu silently reached out and took off the watch from his left wrist, handing it to Lu Jiayan. The more he looked at the watch, the more familiar his eyes became, and a familiar face flashed through his mind that could no longer be familiar. Tan Kuning. He looked up at the person lying on the hospital bed, and the pitiful feeling in his heart immediately disappeared. The latter shrugged innocently. Sorry, Lu Xiao, the little sisters has to help. Take this watch to Ning Ning, and inside, I took a picture of the documents hidden by Jiang Tsong in Qianlu, which recorded a list of various illegal transactions in Qianlu. Yunmu's eyes changed. The Jiang family is involved in drug trafficking with Southeast Asia. These charges combined, the Jiang family's downfall is already determined. She is not someone who is unprepared to engage in loss-making transactions. She doesn't care about the others, but she must make the Jiang family pay the price. She learned from Gu Huijing that Qianlu and the Jiang family are closely related. When Tan Kenning received the invitation letter from Qianlu, the most dangerous place was the safest and most prominent place, which was the most dangerous place. No one would have thought that the Jiang family had hidden everything in Qianlu. Dr. Lu, it's already so late. It's time to get off work. Take your time and don't see you off, she said with a smirk as she looked at Lu Jiayan's melancholic gaze. Lu Jiayan thought to herself, if it weren't for you, I would have finished work long ago. After Lu Jiayan left, Shirxia walked to Yunmu's bed and was about to say goodbye when she heard a woman with a sickly expression speak. Did you tell him? Ah. Shirxia didn't react for a while. Yunmu pouted, feeling somewhat embarrassed. Just say, did you tell Sui Yu about my injury? Shirxia finally understood her thoughts and immediately nodded, I'll tell you, sir. As she walked out of the ward with her phone in hand, Yunmu opened his mouth and didn't say anything. She stared at the ceiling of the ward and fell asleep without realizing it. Yunmu had a dream where she saw another woman standing beside Sueyu, gentle and virtuous, speaking softly. She saw a gentleness that had never appeared in Sueyu's eyes before. The scene changed, and it was in Qianlu. She watched her hand holding the needle tightly held by Jiang Tsong, feeling dizzy in front of her eyes. She lay on the ground, with uncontrollable pain in her chest and bleeding all over the floor. After living in the hospital for half a month, she felt that her limbs had degenerated. In addition to the sympathy from the girls, the most frequent one was in summer. "Why isn't your boss coming?" Yunmu was eating the cantaloupe stuck in his toothpick while watching Xia busy tidying up the table for her. She couldn't achieve such a virtuous appearance. Thinking of this, the dream she had half a month ago flashed through her mind. "Mr. has been busy with company matters lately, and I wish 24 hours were 48 hours. Xia finished cleaning up the last bit of garbage, but since Mr. asked me to come and take care of Miss Yun, it shows that I am still worried." She heard this sentence very well. "Don't Miss Yun, just call me Yunmu." She really liked Xia very much, not much, but not awkward. Xia, have you ever been in love?" Upon hearing these words, Xia, who had just sat down, blushed slightly and felt uneasy. "No," she said. Yunmu nodded knowingly and said, "It's just right. I'll introduce you to some people someday." "No need." "Oh, don't be shy." Although she joked so much, she didn't make any further jokes. The interface of the phone was stuck in WeChat chat, looking at the only contact who was on the top. The last chat was more than half a month ago, and she hesitated and edited, but in the end, she still sent it over. "Aren't you coming to see me?" After posting, she picked out the only emoji from her collection, and a little girl blinked pitifully. "I thought it would take a long time to get a reply, but I didn't expect the other party to reply immediately. I didn't see you so pitiful when I went to fight with someone. Are you blaming me for disrupting your plan? According to Lu Jiayan, you arranged for Xia." Sui Yiming knew that women were just talking soft for a while, but she still followed her heart and said, "If it's your fault, can you still message me here?" "Yunmu, do you underestimate yourself too much or do you underestimate me too much?" She actually doesn't understand what it means to underestimate herself or him. But she has never been fond of delving deeper. "Aren't you coming to see me?" Returning to the original topic, but this time she didn't receive a reply from the other side until the day she was discharged. Looking at the man talking to Lu Jiayan outside the door, Yunmu still smiled. Lu Jiayan saw the person who quietly walked over from Suiyu with a smile on his face and said, "Mr. Sui, I heard you recommended the meeting on the other side of Ozu. I didn't expect Miss Yun to have such great skills." Suiyu's face remained expressionless, and he had nothing to say about Lu Jiayan's teasing. After Lu Jiayan left, Suiyu turned around and looked at Yunmu, who had been standing behind for a while. The woman had a bright smile on her face, and her eyes couldn't conceal her happiness. "Suiyu, really?" He immediately understood to whom Lu Jiayan had just spoken, allowing women to bounce around behind him. "What?" As Lu Jiayan said, "You postponed the meeting to pick me up from the hospital." End of this chapter.